We're going to kick things off, and we want to welcome everyone to our third stream in the Road to Success speaker series. We wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out of their schedule to be here with us today. For anyone who is joining for the first time, my name is Lucas Conyer. I'm an enablement specialist here at ShopMonkey, and I'll be kicking off the event today. I'm a lifelong automotive enthusiast, really enjoy watching what's going on in the industry and how it's growing and evolving year over year. And it's really exciting to be part of a company like ShopMonkey with a mission to help shops and businesses and business owners thrive. Now, this series, the Road to Success series, has been put together with the goal of helping other shop owners and employees across the industry by addressing popular topics and best practices. Here at ShopMonkey, we really have some amazing customers that share that exact same passion in wanting to help others out in the industry. So we really look forward to presenting these sessions over the next few months. This series will bring shops from various verticals of the industries together to share those experiences and best practices. And in our last stream, we had Mike and Zach from Mad Hatter Automotive present going down the rabbit hole of social media. This was really an amazing session. We really recommend anyone who hasn't seen it to go catch up on it. They talk through what success they have had in social media and what they recommend other shops think about if they want to get more involved with marketing their own shops. Now, if you missed the last stream, be sure to check out on our YouTube page and check out those episodes and share them with any of your industry colleagues. Now, for the third stream in our Road to Success series, we're really excited to have Chris Salvo here from Electrified Garage to present today's topic, getting tuned up for EV repair. Chris, we're really excited to have you with us here today to talk about this really important topic of preparing for the future of EVs and what it takes to service them today. I had the pleasure of getting to hear you talk about this topic in person a little earlier this year. And I know I myself walked away with some really, really good aha moments from the information that you shared. Let's kick this session off and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the EV industry. And then we'll jump into the rest of today's conversation.
Perfect. So I started by going to school actually in the Charlotte area. I went to Central Piedmont Community College, and I completed the BMW STEP program that was done in conjunction with Hendrick Motorsports. I then moved back home to Massachusetts and got a job at a BMW dealership there. Realized fairly quickly that I'm not an awesome flat rate technician, and kind of, I like to take my time. I like to make sure things are right the first time, and rushing wasn't really the way I wanted to do things. So thankfully, there was a place right up the road for me called Turner Motorsports that specialized in BMW aftermarket parts. So I kind of made the jump over to the parts side and got to really learn the aftermarket as a whole, not just BMW specific, but a lot of European brands and a lot of manufacturers that are overseas. Kind of got bored sitting behind a desk, and a friend of mine had started working at Tesla back in 2013. So this was just when Model S was starting to become available. And so I went down, interviewed, got the job as a technician. Tesla, for anybody that doesn't know, they're hourly employees. They don't do flat rate, mostly because everybody would lose their shirt trying to diagnose these cars. So anyways, I stuck around there for about 4.5 years or so. Found a lot of the shortcomings that, Tesla didn't embrace anything aftermarket whatsoever. So much so that, like, if it wasn't the OEM tires, we weren't allowed to put those on the factory wheels. In Massachusetts, winter wheels and tires is a pretty common thing for wintertime. Tesla would not allow you to do anything other than the ones that they recommended. So at that point, I kind of saw there was a niche that I could take advantage of. There wasn't that many companies doing aftermarket accessories or parts. Excuse me. So I started a company called EV Tuning. The first thing that we actually made was door handle repair kits. So the Model S was known for having door handle problems where the door handle physically comes out of the door and you grab it and pull, but then it retracts back into the door. And they would fail. Either they would get stuck out or stuck in. Either way is not good and you can't get into the car. So we designed a kit that made it so that they wouldn't fail again. Then we started doing install of other stuff that we would sell, whether it was winter wheels and tires or black view dash cameras, coilover suspension, different brakes, any type of LED light you could possibly imagine. Honestly, I've never seen a group of consumers that will literally spend 3 or 4 months before they even have the car buying stuff. and keeping it in a pile to install in the car they don't even own yet. But anyways, we kind of realized, okay, we have a business here. And my other business partner is Rich from Rich Rebuilds YouTube channel. People were asking him, can you please help us with installing stuff on our own cars, fixing my salvage car? Tesla won't touch my car. He's like, I'm an IT director. I have no business fixing other people's stuff. But myself and my other business partner, Chad, we're professionally trained technicians. So we do. So we all basically decided to build a small garage in the back of my stepdad's house. We all quit our full-time jobs and moved over to the garage. And that was, we officially opened for business in July of 2019. We now have 3 locations. We have the one that we actually moved out of the small garage into a bigger space. We're now in Amesbury, Massachusetts. I'm actually in Ocala, Florida, which is about an hour and a half north of Orlando. And we have another location in West Beach. So we now have 3 spots. We're looking at further expansion through licensing, consulting, some other stuff that we'll cover, later on in this presentation. That pretty much brings us up to today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Crazy. I think I heard you say 2013 on Tesla. Crazy. I think 10 years has passed where, that's where they started and where they are currently.
Yeah, seriously.
And the amount of manufacturers that are kind of in this EV race now. So really, really important topic. With that being said, everyone, we wanted to just cover a couple industry facts. I'll kind of just set some context. Chris has some really amazing information we're going to go over today. And before we get there, we kind of just wanted to answer 2 questions. And so one of those is, why will EVs be important to independent repair shops, right? And so this is kind of looking into the future a little bit. And so part of that is, there's a list of manufacturers here, but if we just focus on 3 for a second, Toyota, Volvo, and Mercedes all had very interesting announcements over the last few years. Toyota announcing they want 3.5 million annual sales by 2030 of electric vehicles. Volvo wanting to go full EV by 2030. And then Mercedes wanting to launch only new vehicles that are fully electric by 2025, which is 2 short years away. Will they make it? We don't know. Haven't looked into it in terms of how they're achieving that goal. But just to say and see that this list of manufacturers keeps growing is one of the reasons why this will be important to independent repair shops. And the second one is, why are they currently important to independent repair shops today? One of those reasons is ownership is constantly growing day by day, year by year. And so these numbers are a little old now, 2020 to 2021. But back then, the EV growth year over year was 42.7% across the states. And then there was about 1.5 million EVs on the road at that time. So we have to get some updated numbers on this. It comes from external studies done, but it's great to see how these numbers are growing every year. Secondly, and I know this would be a topic that Chris talks about in a little bit, but EV tire procedures are very similar to their ICE counterparts, but they sure have different intervals. And so on average, these tires are wearing out 20% quicker than the tires on ICE vehicles. And one of the last things, I think this one was the most shocking for me when we kind of came across this survey. It was a survey that was done actually in 2022. It was with about 5,000 independent repair shops across the United States. And out of those 5,000, when the question was asked, how many of you advertise that you offer EV services? 60% mentioned that they do not. So it was roughly 40, maybe a little under 40% that mentioned that they do service EV services, EV vehicles, which just means that the opportunity that's left on the table as the years progress is fairly large. And Chris and his team are definitely tackling this in their area. And it's been pretty amazing to see the work that you guys have been able to do in your shop. Now, in today's conversation, we're going to cover a few things. I'm going to kind of set the stage with what we're calling the EV service spectrum, and it's going to be the different topics that Chris kind of talks about, which will include the challenges and pitfalls of servicing EVs. It'll also include required tools for proper EV servicing. And last but not least, we want to see what kind of questions come in. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We're going to pause in between each one of these levels, which we're calling basic, clever, and genius. And we want to make sure we can make this as interactive as possible with the audience that's here with us today, whether that's, kind of experiences you've bumped into or things you're thinking about doing in your shop. Feel free to chat them in. The chat button is on the bottom of your screen. You should be able to click on that. And just make sure it says hosts and panelists when you submit your questions through the chat. I will be monitoring that, and we'll make sure to pause throughout to field some of these questions in Chris's direction. With that being said, what's this spectrum that we're talking about? And this is it right over here. So first, we're going to talk and touch upon basic services. Clever services will be next up. And last but not least, genius services. I think it's pretty interesting to see how this can grow. And it's important to think, well, where today as a shop can I start from a basic level in offering EV services? And what path can I take moving forward? And so, Chris, like I said earlier in the year, this was an amazing topic. I loved listening to all the pointers and experience that you and your team have had. So I'm going to kick it over your way. And as you start, we have a poll question for the audience today. And that is, what EV services do you offer currently, if any at all? So I'm going to let that run in the background. And Chris, I'm going to pass it your way for some basic services. Let us know, what do you think is a good spot that shops can start when it comes to these basic services, or what you think is a good approach here for shops interested in doing EV repairs?
So a lot of people are scared about working on an EV because they're worried about either themselves getting hurt or damaging the vehicle, because the battery in a lot of cases is like the floor pan of the car. But the reality is an EV is 80% the same as a regular vehicle. You're only changing the propulsion system and essentially what the gas tank would be. So you still have tires, you still have brakes, you still have suspension, you still have a 12-volt system. So all of those things are the same as any other car. So there's no reason for you to be scared of changing tires, or doing an alignment. If anything, some stuff tends to wear out more frequently, and that's because the car is much heavier. Because the center of gravity is much lower, people tend to drive the car more aggressively than they kind of realize they're even doing. And for these reasons, like we said, tires are going to wear out faster. You've got the instant torque on of acceleration, but you also have what's called regen braking. Regen braking means that it's going to take the motor itself when you let off the accelerator and it turns it into a generator. So you're using your kinetic energy to recharge the battery a little bit. But when you're doing this, it's like basically applying the brakes more firmly than you would normally. And so because of that, you're going to wear especially if it's a two-wheel drive vehicle, you're going to wear out that the drive wheels much more faster than the other ones. So tire rotations are far more important. But let's see, the other thing, because of regen braking, you don't use the physical mechanical brakes as much. So they end up, similar, like if you let a car sit for a year or two, those brakes are going to get corroded. They're going to get rusted. And when you do need to use them, they're not necessarily going to work the way they're supposed to be. And the owner of the vehicle is not necessarily going to notice this because it's going to be a gradual thing. And then once you go and actually, take everything apart, clean it, lubricate it, and put it back together again, they're going to step on that pedal for the first time and be like, holy crap, I had no idea I had that much brakes. Other than that, like suspension wise, especially the early cars were based on very similar to an S-Class Mercedes. So the Germans love throwing as many control arms as they possibly can into a situation. And the bushings just they weren't stiff enough for the type of torque and the type of forces being put on those suspension components. So the older Model S used to have ball joint issues where the stud of the ball joint would literally shear right off. And then the bushings themselves would rip and tear. So it's not unusual to be replacing all of the suspension components on a car at 50 to 70,000 miles. And because of the cost of those components and the fact that, at least for the rear, you have to drop the subframe in order to do some of it, you could be looking at $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 worth of repair bill for the customer. Trying to think of what else. There's basic things. So you're not doing oil changes anymore. You're not doing tune-ups anymore. Cabin filters is a big one that a lot of other manufacturers have problems too. If you don't change them frequently, you get that like musty basement or footlocker smell inside the car. Teslas seem to be more prone to that because of the way the HVAC box is designed. Wiper blades are a simple, easy one. Key fob batteries are quick and easy. But really checking the suspension, retorquing the suspension because things tend to get loosened up over time. And alignments. Alignments is a big one. So if the car the car isn't properly aligned, you're essentially scrubbing the tires down the road, which is kind of common sense for everybody. But that's wasted energy going down the road. And because the cars are far more sensitive to things like that, you're going to notice a decrease in range. So for everybody that has range anxiety, the last thing you want is a car that isn't aligned properly. But those are pretty much the basic things that make the most sense to look at.
No, that makes sense. That's and to your point, it's a lot of similar components to what ICE vehicles see today. And then one question that actually came in from the audience was, do current labor guides include repair time estimates for EVs? Let's say, the control arms you're talking about, or brakes or whatnot. What's been your experience with labor guides and time estimates for EVs?
So if you go to service.tesla.com, they're actually allowing free access to the repair manuals, wiring diagrams, and repair instructions, and access to the parts catalog, but you can't order anything unless you get set up. They do have labor guides in there. The problem is they're pretty nebulous, where you won't know. For instance, if you're going to do a drive unit in the back of a car, the subframe has to come down. You got to replace X, Y, and Z, put it back in the car. You've now effectively, changed the geometry of everything in the back. You need to align the car again. Well, is the alignment part of that correction line, or is it a separate line? And so in some instances, it's not very clear. In other cases, it is. So that so you don't know whether or not you're double dipping on labor, or you're overcharging the customer to do the same repair. And Tesla has notoriously been a problem with this since day one, where it wasn't very clear, or another example would be like, they have two condensers in the front on a Model S. If you're doing one, or if you're doing two, either way, the bumper has to come off. Are you charging the customer to take the bumper off twice? How does that correction line account for the fact that you're doing two versus one? Or same thing with, evacuating the AC. You really only need to do it once. If you're doing both condensers, you shouldn't be billing for that time twice. So some of it can be pretty tricky, and you kind of have to use some of your own intuition as far as that. If it all of a sudden says like it's going to take 7 hours to do two condensers, you kind of know there's something wrong there, and it shouldn't really be that. It's probably half that amount of time.
Right. And have you had any experience, and I don't know if we talked about this last time, but when it comes to other manufacturers and their EV offerings that are on the road today, have you bumped into any labor guides or repair kind of procedures that address their new models from EVs, or has that also been kind of a little nebulous in terms of finding that information?
Yeah, so we found with BMW and with Chevrolet, with like the Bolt and the Volt, that a lot of times they're not quoting the proper times, and so it's actually they're on the conservative end, and it makes it very difficult if you're going to do apples to apples, comparison. That we're going to quote more than what the dealer is necessarily going to quote, and the reality is the dealer is probably losing money to do this because they're just trying to push forward and get into this space. So. Outside of that, I found that Volvo is pretty accurate. They seem to, have thought this through pretty well. Rivian is kind of tricky because they're still doing everything mostly as warranty. So from, a stockholder standpoint, they don't want to see warranty costs to be outrageous. So I think their numbers are kind of artificially, lowered. Tesla used to do the same thing, where like if all of a sudden there was a recall on a specific part, that part would magically drop to like $0 or $2 or whatever, just so that warranty cost would drop down. Wow. So it makes it kind of tricky for a third party to be competitive or compare apples to apples and let your consumer make an educated decision.
Right. No, that makes sense. And for those throwing in questions in the chat, there's a few here, and we're going to make sure to trickle these in throughout the rest of the conversation today. To kind of wrap up from the basic side of it, I know, Chris, one of the things that we talked about last time was consumer education. What have you seen, or what would you recommend as a good best practice in terms of how shops are communicating with their customers in terms of, hey, maybe this is what you've heard. Maybe, I think there's a general consensus that EVs need less maintenance or less service, right? How have those conversations been for you? Or do you think there's a good starting point for shops who are looking to venture into EV services that they should consider?
Yeah. So what we do, a couple of different things. One is kind of the speech I already gave about, 80% of the cars are the same. We ourselves offer like a new owners orientation that we do on a monthly basis. And we kind of partnered with some of the local Tesla clubs. So they have all of their new members or people that maybe just got their car or are still waiting for their car to come in. And basically what we do is we sit down with a Tesla. We have a big television and we just mirror a cell phone to the TV and we walk through the entire screen of how everything works. And then from there, we explain, okay, these are the different types of things for maintenance. So on year one, it's X, Y, and Z. So typically it'd be wiper blades, cabin filters, clean and lubricate the brakes and check your alignment. On year two, those cars still have coolant like a regular vehicle. They still use hydraulic brake fluid like a regular vehicle. So brake fluid's usually every 2 year kind of thing. At the 2 year mark, the other thing is the air conditioning system. So the AC system doesn't just keep you in the cabin comfortable. It also is what cools the battery. So there's a heat exchanger between the battery and the coolant that goes through it. If the air conditioning system doesn't work or doesn't work properly, the car is not going to be able to do what's called supercharging or any DC fast charging at that point because it can't cool the battery fast enough, and there'll be thermal alerts that'll be set off. So we pull all the refrigerant out. There's a desiccant bag and filter, which you guys may be familiar with already. That gets replaced, and then we recharge the system. At that point, you can kind of check the old bag and make sure, okay, there's not any, metal shavings or things of that nature that would be indicative of the compressor being on its way out. In which case, you obviously want to replace the compressor proactively rather than wait for it to completely fail because, somebody doesn't want to be on a cross-country road trip and have this die on them.
Right.
Then year three is very similar to year one. At year four, and it kind of varies depending on mileage too. Coolant should also be done. Not so much because it's not going to see the same type of work that in a traditional engine it would. So it doesn't get hot. At most, it's going to be 120 degrees. So it's not going to be over 200 degrees the way it would be in a normal engine. But we have seen issues where most of the components are aluminum and there's issues with alkalinity and acidity, and you can have problems with corrosion and things that happen that way. They all use the same European blue or BMW coolant. But depending on, how many miles they put on that car, you could find issues with the coolant that way. Drive units is kind of the other weird thing that Tesla doesn't have a service interval for, but it's basically like a transfer case would be in a regular car. So the transfer case, I like to do it between 30 and 40,000 miles. The Model 3 and Model Y have a regular spin-on filter. It looks like a lawnmower filter. So, obviously at some point somebody was intending on changing it. Just Tesla conveniently neglected to mention when that's going to be.
Right. Wow. Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think these are all great points and things to think about, right? And I think one of the biggest takeaways is I love the idea of those new owner orientations, familiarizing customer bases with what they can expect if they're going to be looking to own an EV into the future. And so that's amazing. And actually, just to quickly recap on the poll question, it looked like about half of the audience with us today has not or does not currently offer EV services and are potentially hesitant in doing so. And then there's actually a good group here that are currently offering EV services. That's pretty amazing. This is really cool to see kind of the breakdown of the audience today. And Chris, some of the final things you mentioned in this last part almost feel like we're heading in that clever direction. So we're gonna move forward and kind of go through. And as we go there, actually, just as a quick summary for everyone, and this will be kind of a summary for each part of the spectrum we're talking about, but consumer education, using DVIs and talking through preventative scheduling, as Chris mentioned, what are those cycles and what do they look like? Utilizing some of those resources through Tesla and whatnot. And right now, in terms of unique tools and required resources, nothing specific as of yet, right, Chris? I think we're going to get into a lot more unique tools in a little bit here. Yeah. So, but one last question from the audience for that last section. How do you get set up to buy parts? I've tried and it's a huge pain. I'm assuming that was for the Tesla part earlier.
Yeah. So basically their form is set up as though you were supposed to be like a body shop. And so there's a bunch of things in there that it's asking, like, do you have a paint booth? Do you have this? Do you have that? And the reality is you're not going to have that stuff unless you are a body shop of some sort. So what I've found is for those particular ones, I just add an extra picture of my shop, and usually it goes through and it isn't a problem. But Can't say that there's a guaranteed recipe for that. One of my other guys did work for the body shop side of Tesla, so he's usually the expert for that. So we could, potentially put you in touch with him, and maybe he can help you with whatever the pitfalls are or whatever the issues are you're having. But I've heard from a number of people that, some people apply and they get approved in 2 days. I've seen other people that apply and it takes 2 months. Doesn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason. It's maybe whoever it is on the other end of the computer didn't like what they saw. But we can certainly try to help you out with that.
That's amazing. Thank you, Chris.
Yep.
All right. Now for part 2, clever services. I think this is pretty exciting. I know at SEMA last year, they had a dedicated booth and section that was all for EVs. I think, Chris, you might have been there. You probably saw it as well. But it's fascinating to see what's happening in the world of EVs when it comes to suspension, aftermarket parts, and whatnot. Talk us through what you think this next level up of services that a shop can offer, or services that a shop can offer to their customers based on modification or different things that you feel would be the next level up from basic services.
So, like I was saying before, I've never seen a group of people, and I did a lot with BMWs. So, the E36, E46 guys were always like, literally changed the whole car. But Tesla people, because they have to wait 2, 3, 4 months for their car to show up, they're on Amazon, they're on every forum, they're researching what's the best of this, what's the best of that. There's a tremendous number of websites that have shown up now. So these people buy the craziest knickknacks I've ever seen. There's a lot of custom made stuff now where 20 years ago, we'd have to sit there and design it ourselves. Now you can buy a complete plug and play bolt-in LED lighting system that changes different colors and pulses with the light, with the sound of music and stuff like that. They got things where you can change the center screen so it swivels one way or the other. There's all kinds of different trim pieces you can change. There's new seat covers that are in different colors, different materials. Some of them you can add ventilated seats to a car. But the biggest thing that we see a lot of, because these cars are so capable, a lot of people are taking it to the track. So a lot of the BMW guys are transferring over and getting rid of their M3, and now they're buying a Model 3. And so, we're doing a lot of full suspension upgrades, coilovers, adjustable control arms, bigger wheels and tires, larger brakes, and setting them up with track spec for alignments as well. So, there's the sky's the limit. I can't believe the amount of stuff that people have come out with, and a lot of it, frankly, you can go on Alibaba and find it, and that's where everybody else is getting it from anyways. But things like power frunks, so that their front trunk, so to speak, will open on its own and it's powered. Or in the hatch as well, the rear trunk, same thing. They have door handles that present on their own for the cheaper models that don't do that the way the Model S does. They now have self-presenting doors that will open and close on their own as well. It's amazing the amount of stuff that people want. So somebody will spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 on a brand new car and then come to us with another $5,000 to $10,000 worth of accessories and say, I want all of this put on it. And it's 2, 3, 4 days worth of work to get it all on there. It's all easy stuff. It's a brand new car, so it's going to come apart easily. All this stuff, for the most part, is pretty well engineered and goes together pretty easily. The trickiest thing I would say in a lot of cases is, where do you pull power from for any of the 12-volt accessories? I've seen some horror stories where people try to tag into the yaw sensor for the ABS to get power for a radar detector. So every time the thing went left or right, the radar detector had a nervous breakdown. But other than that, it's not any different than a regular car. And people need to understand that it's not scary. And as long as you're respectful of the high voltage stuff, there's nothing really to worry about. The vehicles have jack points, just like any other car. So a lot of people are probably going to run into individuals that say, well, you need to use these special pucks to put underneath my battery so you don't damage my battery. And the reality is, Tesla doesn't use them. I don't use them. But if it's going to make your customer feel better, they're $15 on Amazon. You might as well just use them. And all it's basically doing is, there's a stud that goes up inside of a hole that is really used for alignment purposes when the car is manufactured. Excuse me. But for the sake of putting something in there, so you don't put a metal lift pad underneath that, that you're lifting the car by the right points and there's not going to be any issues. That seems to be the other. No, we don't. No, Kyle, we don't need the pucks. You can say puck
great.
you. Yeah, that's awesome. No, but customers are going to be adamant that you do need them. And there's enough people that have created fear on the internet that, kind of is what it is. It's not really worth having that disagreement. If it makes them feel like you're respectful of their car, and you're going to, they're conscious of the danger that is there. So you could damage things if you don't put this in the right spot. But yeah, I would suggest if you're apprehensive, just buy them, use them. It's not going to make a difference, but they're not necessary. I've seen people just use blocks of wood too, honestly, and it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and Kyle brings up a good point there, and maybe this is something that others have bumped into, but he mentioned I've been pushing off customers because I don't have them, right? So it's to your point, I think it's fair to mention if it makes a customer feel a little more comfortable, sure. But yeah, that's some interesting information. And then Chris, from the aftermarket side, I believe last time we had spoke, there was a couple of suppliers or a couple of vendors that you were working with, right? That were maybe the go-to possibly for Tesla, but were there a few vendors that you work with that might be good partnerships for others as well to think through if they wanted to offer similar services in their shop?
Yeah. So some of the suspension stuff that's on the screen right now is from a company called Mountain Pass Performance. It's a company out of Canada that makes basically all replacement suspension components. A lot of that stuff is somewhat race oriented, but a lot of it is for daily driven vehicles, and it just has upgraded ball joints or bushings, or uses a sealed bearing instead of a bushing. So the likelihood of failure is much less, and the steering feel of the car is much better. There's a company called EV Offer, so Electric Vehicle Offer. They make a lot of the knick-knacky stuff, as I call it, as far as interior trim, custom steering wheels, the power frunks, power trunks, the door handles and doors that open and close, that kind of stuff. You can look to Rock Auto. Rock Auto sells a decent amount of stuff.
Wow.
I'm trying to think of who else. There's IMC, or Parts Authority, which is basically what Rock Auto is. World Pack is some stuff as well, but you have to go into your speed dial and actually pick Tesla or add Tesla in as a brand to be selected. It doesn't come up by default. Napa, believe it or not, is even trying to get into this game, and Napa is like 30 years in the past. So
wow, that's amazing.
They have some control arms and some other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it's moving forward in terms.
Yeah, people are finally starting to take it seriously. I think just to get back to Kyle a little bit more, like if you want to instill confidence in them that you know what you're doing. So, I mean, buying the pucks is an easy way of showing, hey, I have my stuff together and I understand this is what you're expecting. But the other thing is that these people couldn't necessarily afford this vehicle. And so it was a reach for them to do it, especially when Elon told them it was going to be 35 grand. And in reality, it ended up being like 50. So these people want to make sure that these cars are going to stay on the road for an extra 5 or 10 years, where a traditional person, maybe 5 years, 100,000 miles, they swap out for something else. These people are expecting to keep it for 10 years. They're also told it needs less maintenance and, there's less likelihood for failure. So they're going to be more apt to want to do more with you than a traditional customer that's just going to swap out for a new car. They either need it to last that long because financially they can't afford to go get another one, or they're under the expectation of, like, from a fuel economy, and they're saving the environment and everything else. So the likelihood of seeing a car and having a more long-term customer is more of a reality with these type of people.
That's amazing. Yeah, Chris. And then that kind of leads into, I know second part of the Clever Services was thermal management. And when we talk about keeping these cars on the road longer and different services that are offered, I know this was kind of a little more advanced in terms of services that happen. But yeah, can you walk us through what this also looks like, or what this conversation looks like with customers?
Sure. Yeah. So we kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier. So you obviously don't have an internal combustion engine. So all of the accessories that would be power steering, heat, and air conditioning, those all have to be standalone systems now. And typically they're a high voltage system. So air compressors. They have one of two systems. They have a traditional air conditioning system like a regular car. The newer vehicles are actually switching over to a heat pump style system instead. So they basically reverse it depending on they want heat or cool come out of it. And they did that for efficiency. The older vehicles, it's called a PTC heater. So it's like a high voltage resistance heater, like a big toaster oven, basically. So anybody in a northern climate knows how inefficient baseboard electric heat is. That's what the early Model S and X were using, and actually Model 3 too. So when those things fail, they tend to short out, and then you don't have any more heat, and that's a big issue, especially if you're in a northern climate and defrost your windshield. And also it requires more energy to do so. So in the wintertime, you can see a decrease of between 20 and 30% of what the battery's range would potentially be, because you're busy trying to keep the passenger compartment warm, or you're trying to keep the windscreen clean. So for the air conditioning system, there's that desiccant bag and filter. That should be done every 2 years or 24,000 miles. Tesla has kind of pushed that service interval further out. I'm sure you're familiar with other OEMs. Conveniently, service intervals start to get further and further out because they don't want it to be part of either prepaid maintenance or whatever else it may be. The reality is, from doing this for 10 years, that's the best time to do it. You could let it go a little bit longer, but I wouldn't let it go more than 3 years. At that point, then you could run the risk of having compressor failures, people getting stranded. It's more of a severe issue than just being uncomfortable in the car if one of those things fails. So that kind of touches on the biannual service. So every 2 and 4 years is when that desiccant bag and filter should be changed. You're doing the refrigerant at that same time, adding the POE oil. It's a non-conductive AC oil, so you can't put PAG oil in these things. If you do, the compressor will basically start to conduct electricity and you'll shut the car down. So you have to make sure that you've got a separate air conditioning machine set up to work on these types of vehicles. And the biggest thing is like we do with our new owners orientations, is explaining, this is what will happen if you do neglect the vehicle. And 9 times out of 10, when you explain that you could get stranded in the middle of nowhere, that's enough of a incentive for them to say, okay, never mind. I'm going to make sure that I do what I'm supposed to do when I'm supposed to do it. But also these people, because like I said, they treat this car almost like a family member that they want to keep around for a while. They're more apt to say yes and agree to doing these types of services without you having to oversell it to them. Like, as long as you come across as genuine and honest, which is also why I'm going to go back to the lift pads again. As long as you come by as protecting yourself that way, and not the stigma of a third party garage where we're just trying to sell you a bunch of services. And, now I'm going to come out with the cabin filter and show you the dirty cabin filter and that kind of thing. Like, people don't want to feel like they're being sold something. So if you explain to them the reason why it needs to be done and not much just come out with a sales pitch, I can't remember the last time somebody told us no, or unless it was not in their budget. But that would be it. Otherwise, it's very easy. These people want to take care of the investment that they've made.
Yeah, absolutely. And then would you also say that your average repair ticket quantity is also fairly higher than it would be in maybe ICE comparable vehicles? And in terms of like how you've been positioning that with customers, I think when we last chatted, it was kind of the idea of some of these services just by nature will be more expensive than their ICE counterpart that they might have been coming from. So it also changes a little bit of that conversation with the customer when they get to maybe more of these clever services that require a little more work.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these services are mostly labor intensive and don't have a so for you to make money. It's a lot easier to make money when it's just straight labor instead of it's a $900 part and I'm only going to make $100 on installing it. It's usually the other way around, where it could be anywhere from $700 to $1,000 or more for the labor portion of it, and the parts are really not that much of the bill. So that obviously is beneficial to you, but when some of these types of things do fail, like the AC compressor fails, you could be looking at like $1,000 for just the compressor itself, whereas a regular compressor is maybe $500 or $600. Same with like the PTC heater, that thing's about $850. A heater core traditionally isn't that expensive, but the labor to do a heater core is probably much more. So, as a whole, it's pretty easy to sell maintenance and service work and have that be the majority of what you do, the same as it would be anywhere else. And then supplement that with all of the other stuff we were talking about. The suspension components are pretty common too, and we find those as part of the annual service that we're doing. Hey, Mr. Customer, X, Y, and Z, your control arms are ripped and torn. We're already going to do an alignment check. We already know the alignment's not going to be good because of these bushings. Let's do these control arms at the same time. So it's not, our average ticket is between $3,000 to $5,000 on one of these service types of jobs, because we find a bunch of other stuff that's wrong and needs to be addressed. For year 1, 2, and 3, you got, huge bills, but year 4 is pretty much when you're going to get people at that point.
That's amazing. And yeah, that's amazing. That's really great information. And then we'll just kind of head over to the summary here. But I think that kind of really sums it up on the idea of, these inspections and DVIs, and also just these annual, biannual services. I believe you also had them as canned services that your team uses in all of your locations, correct?
Yep, correct.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's an efficient way of making sure that your team feels comfortable in positioning this with the customers that are coming in through the door as well. So,
exactly.
And then some of the unique,
yeah. And I said, and being consistent at the same time, like the price is the same for each person. You're not guessing from one to the next. Well, I think this is 4 hours and that might be 2 hours, or, then it's really just down to parts for the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in this one, as we wrap up and jump into Genius Services, high voltage gloves, insulated hand tools. I think those are kind of the big takeaways. If anyone's trying to do a little more in terms of like the clever mid-grade services that steer away from just the basic simple services.
Right. So the reason why you would want both of those tools is predominantly for the HVAC system stuff where it is high voltage. You want to make sure that you're protected when you're taking apart that system, and then also checking to make sure that the system is no longer live before you go and work on it.
Yeah. No, amazing. Chris, thank you. Let's we're going to jump into Genius Service. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. I think we're doing really good on time. As we go into this final section here, there's 2 more polls. This is one of the last. Quick question for everyone. Is your shop currently training to service electric vehicles? So I'm going to launch that right now. Take a second here. I'm going to leave that up in the background. And then Chris, let's jump into the last section here, Genius Services. I think this one, I remember chatting through a lot of this the last time we spoke, and it's just, it's pretty amazing to see the work that you and your team have done on all the vehicles that you all are working on. I know a lot of Teslas, but it's pretty interesting to see how complex this can get. And I'm sure there's a lot of shops out there that are thinking, well, how can I make that switch or make that progression from, offering simple services and quickly, or, over some period of time, making my way to the dealership level services that customers have come to me for. What's different for your technicians? What's different for customers at this point? And how do you go about educating your staff to be qualified in this kind of work?
So for this kind of stuff, this is going to be the equivalent of somebody that's doing entire engines, entire transmissions, the level 3 kind of diagnostic person that understands how to use a scope, understands how CAN bus works, how the other types of buses bus net well. So I mean, this is the thing where trying to figure out why the car has loss of drive. So is it because coolant went somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and basically the car actively monitors if something's going to short out and shuts itself down. So it's not going to allow, or shouldn't allow itself to get to the point where you have thermal runaway, which basically means it catches on fire. That type of instance shouldn't happen unless the vehicle potentially gets in an accident, the same way a regular gasoline car would be. So this is somebody that needs to understand what high voltage is, what low voltage is, how the two systems interact with one another. So you're using low voltage, similar to like a starter solenoid, you're using low voltage to turn on a high voltage contactor. And then that's what distributes the power, or a relay that distributes the power to the high voltage component. So they need to have a firm grasp on how to read a multimeter, how to read wiring diagrams, how to troubleshoot an electrical circuit. to understand, is it a power issue? Is it a ground issue? Is it something that's turned on by power? Is it something that's turned on by power? Is there a communication problem? And that's why, so you have power and ground, but it's not communicating for some reason. It can also be something where, let's say a high voltage component, a cable has, there's shielding on the cable and something's rubbed through the shielding. Understanding and trying to find where that is why you use that high voltage insulation meter. It'll basically run voltage through what should be the insulating part of it. If it doesn't pass that test, then that you've got a bad high voltage wire that needs to be replaced. You could have isolation faults, which means things like coolant or water somehow got in the battery. Tesla is famous for, and actually in the picture, I can't really see in that picture, but basically the drain for the HVAC dumps out on top of the battery, and there's a high voltage fuse cover that's just a piece of steel. And so when the water goes and sits on top of that and pools for a while, it rusts it out and the water falls down inside. There's a high voltage fuse there, and the car will sense that there's water in the high voltage system and shut the whole car down. So you need to be able to figure out how to backtrack and trace that type of stuff down. And in some cases, there are test plans in the repair instructions on how to do that. But over time, you kind of get it. You'll know that there's like common things that they all have to do. And so you'll know that the easy places to start looking would be that high voltage fuse cover, or the drive unit has gaskets for the coolant. Sometimes those gaskets let go and coolant goes into the inverter. That's another common place for things. So you kind of will learn over time. There's some common places for failure, the same as any other vehicle, whether it's like a Subaru and a head gasket or crankcase vent valve on a BMW. Like the Tesla is no different. They have design flaws and failures as well. The hardest part is going to be once you change that component, you now need to remarry it to the car. And so for stuff like that, you need to have access to Tesla's toolbox, which is their basically like a scan tool per se. It's a web-based program. You use a laptop, and then you have to buy some special cables to connect to the vehicle. And then from there, you have to redeploy the firmware to the car. So it basically just reinstalls whatever the existing software was and marries everything together so that everything can talk again. So like if you're changing a battery, you're changing a control module, a drive unit, any of those type of things, this is what you have to do. With drive units, you can also have issues with like a mobilizer, like an alarm, so to speak. You need to program the keys to the drive unit. Otherwise, the car's not going to turn on. So a lot of the stuff is like the same as it would be for an ICE vehicle. The difference is just like what components are you changing? And then how do you get everything to play or talk together at the end?
Right. And I think kind of ties back to Kyle's earlier comment of, having he worked at Honda, Toyota, and then he feels like it's a natural progression from that hybrid tech that's been around for a little bit.
Right.
And how, this is just bigger in terms of DC converters, battery cooling systems. But to your point, It's making sure kind of getting into that rhythm of knowing what these common failures or problem areas are in EVs. And I guess one of the last things on this page that popped up a little later was talent sourcing. Have you felt that it's how has talent sourcing been for your shops? And do you feel like, technicians coming out of school or from different trades are intrigued and learning more about working on EVs? And how have you approached those conversations to attract talent your way?
So from my time when I was, going to school for automotive and whatever, it seemed like electronics class was always the great equalizer of, who's going to make it and who's not going to make it. Some people are just going to be parts replacers for the rest of their life. And that is what it is. And I guess, there's a place and a need for that. But the reality is, if you want to be, a high paid, high valued individual, the electronics stuff is really where, that all is going and has been going for a number of years. I mean, it was that way at BMW. There was over 100 control modules on a car. And if one of them went bad, how do you figure out which one and why? So, for somebody coming right out of school, that's, usually we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes with them in an interview going over the different types of things that they could potentially see and how would they think through how to diagnose and how to figure that out and see, do they have a firm grasp or do they just know the bare basics? Are they paper smart and they don't have any street smarts, or what does that look like as far as that's concerned? I've actually had a lot of success with people that don't necessarily have an automotive background, but understand all of the other things that go with it. So we had one guy that he used to build RVs, and so he would understand all the different systems inside of an RV. I had another guy that he was an amateur mechanic, but he was an amateur pro drone racing pilot. And so he used to build his own drones. You wouldn't believe how much of a similarity there is between drones and a Tesla or any EV for that matter. So, he understood how to build the batteries, how to make the motors work, all the controllers and everything else. He was able to visualize in his head like Iron Man does, where he does that, CGI and just flicks things away. He could do the same thing. Whereas like a traditional mechanic, maybe not the case. Other than that, I mean, most of our guys have come from another highline like BMW, Mercedes, another manufacturer that uses a lot of CAN bus, that has a lot of control modules and has a lot of integration between different systems. So somebody that's of that that can understand those concepts and has like a good mindset with that, that's really the type of person that's going to have to be, the future for doing this type of stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Thinking about how it's kind of the same school of thought, but also slightly different, and how to look out for some of those red flags. Yeah, that's amazing. And then kind of leading into the summary for Genius Services, I know we talked through some of those unique tools. So we talked through the talent and how complex these repairs can get. But from the unique tools mentioned here, anything that the audience here with us today should be really thinking about if they want to go from 0 to 100 and start offering more services in the future? What should they be looking at and investing into the future in their shops to get to that level one day?
Yeah, I'm just looking up the insulation meter is made by Fluke. I'm just getting the number now. It's a 1587 FC, so Frank Charlie. And that comes with a bunch of different test leads, an amp clamp, and that will allow you to test the insulation capabilities of whatever the component is you're looking at. As far as a high amperage power supply is concerned, there's a company called PowerMax that makes essentially, like when I worked at BMW, the car would consume a tremendous amount of energy when it's programming. And if it's not running, the alternator obviously isn't turning. So EVs are probably even worse from a power hungry standpoint. So you want at least a 75 amp version of that power supply. A lot of them are adjustable. So you can adjust them from 12 or 13 volts all the way up to 16 volts. The new 2021 and newer cars from Tesla that have lithium 12 volt batteries, they're actually a 15 or 16 volt battery. So you have to be able to charge them at that higher amperage in order to get things to process the way they're supposed to. High voltage safety equipment. So we already talked about the insulated gloves. Red Wings, Skechers, and a few other companies are making electrostatic, like isolated shoes, so that you don't necessarily conduct electricity through your feet. Insulated hand tools. There's a number of companies. I think Worth has one that's pretty comprehensive. It's about $2,000, but it's all the different hand tools. So it's ratchets, it's extensions, it's sockets, it's screwdrivers, pliers, all that different type of stuff. So it's insulated. So in the event that you accidentally do touch something, hopefully you don't get killed, and it may just be, it won't be comfortable, but you're not going to die. Then the high voltage hook is basically a big fiberglass hook. If you remember, was it Snaggletooth? Was it Snaggletooth or Snagglepuss? The cartoon guy, exit stage left. It's basically one of those big hooks. And so if somebody is getting electrocuted with DC, it's not going to push them away the way it would with AC. So that hook is going to allow you to grab that person and pull them away from whatever, whatever they're getting electrocuted by, without you becoming part of that circuit as well. The only other thing I would say is, like, depending on your fire department, they may want you to have both chemical and CO fire extinguishers to put out fires. But that's kind of, there's not a lot of consistency with that one. Down here in Florida, they want me to have CO. Up north, they only want me to have chemical. So it's kind of at your discretion. But trying to think if there's anything really else. Yeah, I mean, the obvious safety glasses and things of that nature. Don't wear jewelry. Don't wear anything that's going to conduct electricity while you're working on this type of stuff. Pay attention to the rest of your clothing too. If you got you shouldn't have metal studs on your pants anyways, but to damage cars, but any of that type of stuff, you could accidentally touch two things together. You don't want to do that. So you need to make sure that you're conscientious about all of your clothing.
What would you say an average? So if you thought about it, roughly an average cost of everything kind of mentioned, if someone's in the audience thinking that sounds like a lot, but money wise, if a ballpark figure, what do you think that would run a shop?
Total, it shouldn't be more than $4 or $5 grand altogether.
Okay.
And it's safety stuff. So it's, you can't really put a price on safety as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing, Chris. And then I know, I'm sorry.
That's the one life is one too many.
Yes. Yep. And with that being said, there's a lot of really great information that's coming up all throughout this session, right? I think it's a topic that will continue to be unpacked over the next decade, probably longer, as the industry kind of adapts to all this. And a question we had for everybody, and this is more so just to kind of see what the appetite for this is, as the industry keeps looking into how do we get more shops involved with EV services. Would EV consulting be something your shop would be interested in? And it's something we're going to talk about here in a second. But just to see, what the audience thinks about this, I'm gonna let the poll run here. But Chris, I'm gonna push this slide forward for you to kind of chat about this a little bit.
Okay. So basically what we offer is like a monthly consulting thing where we'll help you with getting set up so you can buy parts. We'll go through that application with you, get that squared away. We've already pre-negotiated with some of the vendors for parts so that you don't, where we consume more than most would, you're going to get the same pricing or preferred pricing that we do. You would have us in the background as a resource. So I've got 4 different technicians that, if you run into a problem, hey, I accepted this car in, we started working on it and we're kind of over our head, can you help us? Those guys can help you with that. We have a pretty large knowledge base of things that we've learned and figured out over time that we can, provide access to you as well. And then worst case scenario, we can also remote into a laptop and help you with trying to diagnose or figure something out that way as well. So we do this on a monthly basis. It's $3 grand a month to do so. And then we're also developing a large curriculum of training that you would be eligible to take at a discounted rate. And then we're also looking at licensing as well. So once you completed that training, and we feel comfortable with the level of proficiency that you have, we can talk about licensing our brand and you basically become a powered by Electrified Garage shop. And at that point, there's, implied proficiency, honesty, trustworthiness, and it's a known brand. And, we've got people from all over the world that are asking, how can I open an electrified garage? Or, I bought this car, how do I fix it? I don't know how to do this. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at, offering to everybody.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. I think, it was mentioned a little earlier in the session, but access to resources and kind of standardized access to resources. I mean, I know Tesla's kind of the big name, but all the manufacturers coming out with all these different versions of EVs, there's definitely a lot of similar components, but some standard knowledge that, maybe isn't accessible widely for everybody yet. And so just knowing where to kind of tap into and who to reach out to. And I know we had put your information on here as well. Anyone who's in the audience, feel free. We're going to have all this posted later on our website, but we have Chris's contact information in here as well for any questions that you might think of after today's session. And it's safe to say, I think this session covers a lot, right? We're talking basic, clever, genius, we're talking a lot of different services, and maybe one session isn't enough to, it's not the silver bullet that's going to solve everything, but it's a great starting point to start thinking about where can a shop start and where can they get to if that's the direction they want to go in. And so, Chris, thank you. I know we stayed over a little bit extra there. Everyone that stuck around, thank you so much for sticking around. Chris, thank you once again for joining in for episode 3. We love having you and chatting through these topics. We look forward to maybe having you back in the future to kind of expand on some of these thoughts. And for everyone that's in the audience, thank you so much for being here with us. We look forward to hosting more of these sessions with various topics, more EV related and just general shop information and best practices. But Chris, hand it over to you just for any final thoughts.
No, well, I just kind of typed it in the chat anyways. I was going to say thank you for everybody that did come, everybody that stuck around and the questions that were asked. Feel free to shoot me an email if you got any other questions or want to talk about consulting, training, or licensing, and I'm happy to help out however I can. And I'd like to see more shops be able to be comfortable and competent in doing this stuff, because it is the future, and nobody wants to see anybody get left behind.
Yeah, that's very well said, Chris. Thank you once again so much. Everyone, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your week, and see you next time. Thank you.